if my ability to do things was persuaded by other people's confidence in me, then I don't think I could have had the career I've had.
Hello, my name's Nathan Brake. I'm the creative director of VidMedia, a creative contents agency. It's my privilege to welcome you to Legacy Conversations. This channel exists to share the journeys of incredibly successful individuals, to pass on the lessons that they've learned, the mindsets that they've adopted, and the disciplines that they've developed in order to get to where they are today. My hope is that in sharing these journeys, we can learn from them and apply these same principles to our own growth in order to quicken it, so that we too can create lasting legacies. This week I'm speaking with Beaumont. Mark has spent the last 2 decades pushing the limits of endurance. He holds several world records. Most notably, he's the fastest man to cycle around the planet. Very cool. He's so interesting to listen to. There's so much to learn from him. I loved hearing about what goes into a challenge, an adventure, and actually that sometimes even just to get to the start line can be just as big as the actual adventure itself. Mark gives us a great insight into how you go about fulfilling your dreams. Enjoy. Mark, thank you so much for meeting with me today. It's an absolute pleasure to meet with you. I'm really interested to kind of hear about your epic journey. You've done not only one thing, but like a multitude of things that most people would never even accomplish. You've done so many. So I'd like us to go back and start with, what was life like for you growing up? Where did you grow up? What was that texture, that world?
I grew up in rural Perthshire, a little village called Bridge of Cally near Blairgowrie, for those that know Scotland. And my parents, especially my mum, took the slightly unusual decision to homeschool myself and my 2 sisters. So I'm in the middle, big sister Heather, little sister Hannah, and we didn't leave the farm very much until we went to high school. Well, I did a bit of a taster term in primary school to see what school was like, and then went into high school, which was 30 miles away. It was in Dundee. And so when you're homeschooled, your parents are running an organics farm on a small scale, so it's like 60 acre. It's an amazing, it's all you know. As a child, it's all you know. But looking back now, and with a bit of context, you realise that was quite an alternative, environment to grow up in, because you've got an incredible amount of freedom. You're only actually, in school for an hour or 2 a day. The rest of the time is out on the farm and the great outdoors. So given a huge amount of freedom. And I guess from that freedom and that countryside and that, work ethic from being on the farm all the time grew some pretty early adventures.
Wow, and did that kind of then spark kind of that wonder in you to kind of, what if I could do that, what if I could do that, do you think?
Well, I think you've got to be very careful in conversations like this not to sort of use hindsight and the certainty of what you did to sort of paint the way you saw the world. It would be incorrect to say that I grew up planning to be an adventurer, to go on expeditions to over 100 countries, to travel the world. I didn't have that reference point. I left the farm once or twice a year. Okay, we went out locally, but we didn't travel. We didn't go on family holidays. We were on the farm, and so my reference point socially, in terms of travel, in terms of business, because both of my parents worked on the farm, was pretty limited. So I think even when I left school and started to travel more, I think it would still be a lie in my early 20s to say that I planned to do what I went on to do. I would say life for me has been following your ideas, realizing that through doing stuff which you didn't quite know where it was going to land you, doors open. So if I was to think of my career in my 20s and 30s, maybe half of it was stuff I originated, ideas that I had and I got people to back me. The other half is opportunities that have come my way because I've been out there. You know, I've built a credibility, I've built a public profile, and I've built the ability for people to go, well, we'll ask Mark to do that. And some of the best things in life I've not come up with, but I've been in the ring, I've been out there, you know, I've had the network, I've had the credibility to be asked to do things which have taken me in totally different directions. So I've never really been one for having a 5-year plan or a life plan. I think I have been very good at being furiously busy at what's in front of me. And I think if I was to think of my own daughters, the only superpower I want them to have is to back their own ideas. And, you know, if they're book smart, great. But I think what's more powerful in life is actually having the gumption to back your own ideas. And, you know, I've by definition spent my adult life doing things that people think is impossible, and I've been surrounded by people saying, you know, you can't do that, or there's no reference point for it. So if my ability to do things was persuaded by other people's confidence in me, then I don't think I could have had the career I've had. The opportunities I've had has been, you know, a sense of mischief, a sense of wonder, a sense of trying to do things that have not been done before. I just love that concept of trying to do things, you know, which are, you know, completely unfounded, and you know, being pioneering. I mean, I think I grew up on a solid fodder of fiction and non-fiction, which was just based on, you know, a pioneering spirit, whether it was, you know, adventure books or, you know, my own adventures on the farm. So I think what I've done in my adult life is just an extension of that. But what I think happens with a lot of adults is that sense of wonder, that mischief gets sort of taught out of you. And I say, if I was to hand on one thing to my daughters, it would be to never grow up in that sense, you know, to continue to back your ideas and to continue to have a sense of wonder, because it's extraordinary where that can take you.
And does that mean something you've fought actively to hold on to and make sure you don't lose?
I wouldn't say that I've fought particularly hard to hold on to it. I guess if you're a child who's homeschooled and then you get dropped into high school, if you've not had those formative years where you're having to assimilate those around you, slightly copy, if you're almost a teenager before you learn to do those things, to socialize, then it's a very conscious experience. So even now, I socially interact in I feel a very conscious way. I think it's ironic that I've got a public profile and I spend my life, you know, standing in front of, you know, big rooms of people, because, you know, I'm still that homeschooled kid. So my point is, have I had to train myself or keep that sense of freedom or that sense of, I think because of my formative years, I've always sort of slightly seen the world from the outside in, and that's okay. And, you know, I've never, of course, in your schooling years, there's a pressure to conform. You know, are you wearing the wrong coloured shoes, or do you have the wrong haircut, or, you know, I mean, school is brutal for, you know, that ability to sort of push out individuality. So of course there's all of that. But then of course you if you don't interact with school until you're nearly a teenager, you do see that for what it is. And I think then when you leave school and you realise actually it's your individual traits and interests that define you. And it's not like I've spent my life, you know, trying to be a maverick and, you know, but I have, to go back to that idea, I have always given myself the freedom to back my own ideas, to explore what I want to do, and to build alliances to make them possible. You can't do any of these things on your own. So whether it's build science and technology businesses as I do now, or cycle around planet Earth, you know, it's ultimately about having that sort of wry smile that, imagine you could do this, and then trying to find people who, you know, who share that level of ambition. And, you know, I'm rarely the technical lead on anything that I do. I'm not the world's best bike rider. I'm certainly not the best accountant, I'm not the best scientist, and yet I interact with these worlds almost like a journalist would. I'm fascinated by these subjects. I like asking the right questions, and I like then being the architect to do things that have not been done before. So the role of an architect is to create the environment. And so as I say, whether it was as a kid going off and taking on my first adventures, or what I do now in my 40s, backing technology to make the world a slightly better place, it's no different. It's just simply giving yourself the license to go, that's potential. How do we nurture that potential? How do we create the right environment for success? And I think what gets trained into us as kids is very much about what you know. Either your academics, your ability to remember stuff or solve problems, which is important. But education only gets you so far. And I know I did absolutely fine at school, but there's plenty of people who, in an academic sense, would do better. But that's a very different thing than having the quiet confidence to back your ideas and do things differently. So I'm acutely aware, in anything you do in life, if it's difficult, you'll have imposter syndrome. You'll be surrounded by people who you think, well, they're better than me, and so they should be, and I always felt that as a professional athlete, where I'm good at what I did. I absolutely had the core competence, but I'm not the best at what I do. I never have been the best at what I do. But quite often it's just the mischief to try stuff that other people won't try, and then realize that being good in and of yourself is not enough. The problems that I solve in life are way too complicated for me just to go, well, I've worked harder than anyone else. Life's not that simple. The problems that I've solved in my life are complex, long-term projects. And so you need to have the ability to look out and think, well, who else do we need? How do we work? How do you do this fundamentally differently? And I'd say, my role in all these projects is not to often be the technical lead, is actually just to be the architect for how could you solve this problem? And I think back to when I was like a 12-year-old kid pedaling across Scotland, my first big adventure off the farm. What I do now, 30 years later, is just a bigger, more complicated, more expensive version of the same.
Wow. So let's go back to that, actually, the 12-year-old boy who decided to cycle across Scotland. How did you kind of come up with that idea, having spent, I guess, the majority of your life just literally being on the farm and not really travelling too much?
When I was young, I was spending, most days, helping mum and dad on the farm. We had 60 goats to milk every morning before breakfast. We had, 200 free-range hens to collect the eggs from. We had 13 ponies and horses to put out and muck out. We had a farm to run. Every day there was, dry stone dikes to fix and mend, and there was a farm to run. So that gives you, a wonderful sort of physical competence. Now, that doesn't just matter in terms of like developing yourself physically, but it also builds real accountability. Because when you have to work, when you have to do stuff, you realize that life is not just about having ideas and somebody else will do it. If you want to build a fence, you build a fence. And I think, from a very early age, having that very sort of applied learning, if this is going to get done, I need to do it. I think it's a really interesting concept, because with children, I grew up in, I'm bringing my daughters up in Edinburgh now, and it's one thing knowing stuff, and it's one thing sort of doing well in class, but it's a very different skill set, having the accountability of, I've had an idea, and it doesn't just get done. It doesn't just happen. If something's going to happen, I need to do it. So people might be watching this going, well, of course, but it's not of course. Children need to learn that, like, ideas are not enough. In this world of social media, ideas are not results. And, if you're going to do something or create something of worth, you have to do it. There's a whole load of doing. There's a whole lot of action which is never seen. It's not the result. And so I do think that the process of running the farm and sort of being accountable for a whole load of stuff was massively important. And when I was 11, I read about somebody who had cycled from Land's End to John O'Groats in the local paper, the Dundee Courier. And I remember getting the old A road map out, the Landy, the farm car, and finding a highlighter pen and finding the roads the length of Britain. And that was my first sort of expedition plan. My mum pointed out quite rightly that I'd not really cycled off the farm before, so I should try something slightly smaller. But that was it. And then I ended up cycling from Dundee to Oban across Scotland, which over 3 days, which was 145 miles. I was 12 at the time.
Wow.
And it wasn't just the ride. It was the planning of it. It was going door to door in Blairgowrie, fundraising for some local charities. It was afterwards handing over a charity cheque to Princess Royal and seeing that converted into a new horse box for a local horse charity that we were raising money for. It was very applied. It was very much about you create it, you do it, you tell that story, you create legacy from the project. And, by the time I was 15 and I was ready to do my first 1,000-mile ride, my first solo ride from Land's End to Shonnock Roads, it was just a bigger version of the same, bigger fundraising target, bigger partnerships with charities, with sponsors, with people in the community who were backing that ambition. And it's interesting then, if I fast forward to post-university and setting off around the world the first time, as I built bridges with the BBC, as I built bridges with big corporate sponsors, as I worked with charities once again, it's still the 12-year-old kid, just going, okay, I've done this before, it's just a bigger version of that. How do we create those partnerships? And I say, understanding that it's pretty clear why I would care. I loved riding my bike, I enjoyed going on adventures. I was inspired when I was a teenager by Ellen MacArthur sailing around the world. Even though I wasn't into sailing, that was just and so in my mind, the round the world cycling record would be the most coveted, the most professional record in cycling. It would be the equivalent of what Ellen did, but on a bike. So I was amazed at that age, in my early 20s, to find that it had barely been done properly, certainly not professionally. The record stood at sort of 276 days. So the record in context is now 78 days, 14 hours, 40 minutes. So in my generation of round the world record attempts, we have taken 200 days off the record. And that's what I'm really proud of. I wasn't just part of that generation, but that's what we did. We really shifted the dial. We took it to a whole other level. So you can sort of imagine then as a 21, 22-year-old at university going, well, if I've got one chance to go on sort of my biggest dream, I'm going to cycle around the world. Not that this should be a career, not that I knew how that would be, but simply because it was just an extension of what I'd done as a kid. And if you've only got one chance, you might as well go as big as you can dream. And that's why the world happened. And so that sort of journey from being a 12-year-old kid pedaling across Scotland to being a 23, 24-year-old cycling around the world the first time, for me, yeah, there's a couple of big jumps in there, but it's pretty chronological. It's pretty obvious. There was 2 professional athletes from my year at school, Alistair Dickinson, who was a prop forward for Scotland, and myself. But most of my school peers, were amazed that I became an athlete because I wasn't a rugby player, I wasn't a cricketer, I wasn't a football player. I was that guy outside of school who rode bikes, rode ponies, and went skiing. I wasn't sort of the playground sporty guy. But for me, the passion was adventure, was outdoors. And I'd say what's really interesting in the adventure world is it's so much more than just the ability to do the sport, because these are sporting endeavours that last often for weeks or months. It's the entire project. How do you give yourself the opportunity to even do these things in the first place? I get approached every week by people who say, I'm off to cycle around the world, climb Everest, row the Atlantic, whatever it is. I know from experience that very few of them will ever get to the start line. They understand why they care, but they don't necessarily understand what it takes to actually put it together. And actually, getting to the start line with any of these big projects is almost harder than the bit you enjoy doing, which is out there, taking on the big adventure.
That is so interesting, because obviously we see you on the bike and don't necessarily see, like you say, all those other elements that almost seem kind of just as big as the actual adventure part to like you say, get to the start line.
Yeah, I would say all the other elements, all the other things you need to learn are almost more important. I'm 6'3" and over 90 kilos. I'm not the world's best bike rider. The key in any of these big trips is consistency, is not breaking down, is not injuring. People think it's about how powerful you are, how fast you are, how strong you are. Sure, you need to be a good bike rider, but the ability to break big records is your ability to suffer, is your ability to take less breaks than others ride more consistently. I mean, this really is here in the tortoise stuff. You know, if you're cycling around the planet or Land's End John O'Groats or whatever it is, it's just the ruthless consistency to keep doing, not break down, finish the race, and do so more efficiently than anyone else. But efficiency over the durations that I talk about is not about, you know, showing off, being fast, showing how powerful you are. It's about ruthless consistency. You know, nobody wins these, you know, races at midday when the sun is shining and you got a tailwind. It's midnight when nobody's watching and you're still out there, absolutely putting the miles in. And I think it's really, really fascinating, having sort of done this for 20 years, seeing how what it actually takes to create these leaps in performance is just really obsessing on the inputs, like really understanding, like putting the time in, understanding your behavior each and every day, you know, minimizing time off. And it's the same when it comes to, you know, fundraising or building the partnerships. It's just putting the process in. Whereas so often what people see when they see these records is the results, quite obviously. I mean, the amount of times that people watch me on the BBC or even read the books and say, I understand what you did now because I've seen the results. I'm like, well, everything you read is with the certainty of the fact I did it. You know, you can't possibly understand it from the perspective of this has never been done before. You can't understand it from the perspective of we're trying to go 37% quicker than anyone's ever gone before. There's no reference point for how you could do this. How do you build that? So when you learn about these things, when you see the results, as difficult as it might be, it's with the certainty of we did it. And I think what's often very difficult when you're building teams around these things is building the vision of this is how you could do things fundamentally differently. There's no reference point for it, but this is how to do it. And then building the right psychology in the team more than anything else to be able to do that.
That's phenomenal. Wow. That's pretty full on. And in your training, kind of the physical aspect, I guess, in terms of looking to cycle around the world, there's obviously going to be parts that you just don't know how to prepare to be there because I've never been there, so I don't know what it's there. So how do you start to begin to prepare yourself for something that you don't know what it is?
Going into any project that's not been done before, there's always going to be massive unknowns. So you've got to have, you know, you've got to have a comfort zone which allows you to operate in a space where not everything is known or not everything is controlled. So I think the first thing is more about attitude. You know, you've got to be okay with a level of uncertainty. People often take on big expeditions very much focused on training and prep, and then they almost leave the event up to chance. So you sort of train incredibly hard and then you get to the start line and you go, let's find out what's possible. And, you know, I'm fitter, stronger, faster, better than I've ever been before. Let's figure out what's possible. My approach to big expeditions is the opposite. Mine is absolutely train hard, but then when I get out there, it's read it off script. I've already predetermined, you know, what every day looks like, you know, everything down to food, hydration, sleep patterns, ride time, everything is prescribed. So in one sense, you're never going to do better than what you set out to do. You're predetermining the outcome. And you do that because it's quite comforting when it gets really difficult out there, because you're not leaving it up to how you feel. You're not saying, well, I feel great, so I'm going to go faster, or I feel terrible, so I'm going to do less. So if you leave it up to that sort of human roller coaster, the psychology of these big projects, I wouldn't trust myself to be that consistent. Whereas because, you know, for example, some people say, I'm going to ride 200 miles a day. And I'm like, are you? Can you control an output? You know, you can't control the road quality or the topography or the way the wind blows. You can control how long you spend on the bike every day and your nutrition. Those are inputs. And so, you know, I know that, say, for the round the world record, I'm going to ride 4 times 4 hour sets a day, 16 hours a day. I'm going to ride at an average of 200 watts or whatever. So these are inputs. And the long-term average will take care of itself as long as you're ruthlessly consistent. I banned my team from asking me how I felt on the second round the world. So, I mean, if it was about performance, if it was about well-being, let's have a conversation about how I feel. But for the rest of my team, for the 40 people that worked for me, it became a running joke because A, you're probably asking me how I feel for some reassurance as to how you should feel. And secondly, how I feel is not going to affect what we do. So I could feel sky high or rock bottom, but we're still going to get on the bike at 4, not 4:05. We're still going to ride 4 times 4 hour sets. So once you take the emotions out of it, you can just focus on being ruthlessly consistent. And you're no longer allowing your emotions to dictate your effort levels. And I think that's massively important because, when the second time we cycled around the world, we broke the previous world record by 37%, but broke the target by 1.44%. Now, you don't go around planet Earth within 1.44% of your target unless you own that before you do it. It can't happen by accident. So if you left and said, right, we're going to break the previous record, which at that point was 123 days, you might well do that. But to go sub 80 and to do what we did, you've got to own that. You've got to absolutely claim it before you do it. You've got to break the entire world down into 4 hour blocks, and you've got to have a fundamentally different way of thinking about the task because it's so big. That the second time I cycled around the world was 2.5 years in the planning and 2.5 months in the execution. So after 2.5 years, you cannot just be going, right, we're at the start of an 18,000 mile race, let's go, which is what a lot of people do. You've just got to, so it's interesting because your question is about how do you deal with things that are outside of your control, and you can see my instinct is to answer with, well, what do you control? And clearly you need to have contingencies. Clearly you need to have, as many things thought through as possible. But shit happens. Things go wrong. Cycling around the world the second time, I crashed 3 times. I, broke some teeth, fractured my elbow, wrote off a vehicle, got stuck at border crossings, had headwinds when there should have been tailwinds. I mean, lots goes wrong and lots goes right. But your coping mechanism is as much about not just contingency planning, but experience. Having been in situations where you've got relevant experience to pull on. I often go back to that sort of when you're in really, really difficult situations, the thing which you value most in your team is that sort of behavioural change under pressure. Are people able to turn up, think, communicate and act relevantly when things are going wrong? If I was to think of the people who have left my team over the years, it's not normally because they're not technically good at their job. You wouldn't be there otherwise. It's normally because of that sort of behavioural change under pressure. And the only way you can build that ability to be consistent, be relevant, be accountable, is to have done high pressured things before. So, if I think about capsizing in the middle of the Atlantic or being in accidents on the mountains or, even some of the situations out on the bike where things go horribly wrong, it's extraordinary how people's behaviour changes in those situations. I say not because they don't know what to do, but just simply they can't continue to function consistently. And the only thing you pull on in those situations is life experience. You can't read that. You can't read a book and, you can conceptually understand, but you can't replicate lived experience. So if somebody was to try and break my round the world record, I think the thing that helped me the most was the fact that I'd cycled around the world before. There's things in your repertoire that you can pull out and go, well, I've been here before. I know how to think. I know how to operate.
Wow. So are there things that you particularly pull on in those kind of life and death situations or absolute disaster moments? And what are those things that you're kind of drawing on to be able to be like, we'll get through this?
I think the challenge with that question is asking me about high pressure situations or life death situations. I'm saying so in the comfort of my living room. There is no danger to me, and I'm trying to sort of think of the right order of words to describe a completely different headspace. I know for a fact when I'm in very, very difficult situations, I go almost emotionless. The emotions come afterwards. We're all human. The upset comes afterwards. But when you're in a situation, let's take capsizing in the Atlantic, 500 miles offshore, the boat goes the wrong way up. There's 6 of you, and one of the guys nearly drowned in the capsize. It took 14 hours to be rescued, unless we did a whole load of swimming, diving, going into the flooded cabins, salvaging the kit that needed found. we were not going to be found. We were just bobbing around in a life raft, 500 miles offshore. So we were alive, but we weren't going to be rescued unless we did a lot, and that a lot was quite dangerous to do. And some of the team didn't cope at all well. Some of the team didn't put any of their training into action. Some of the team never left the life raft, that safety bubble, and just assumed that somebody else would do it. So it brings out all sorts of interesting psychology where you think, well, if I hadn't done what I did, would have other people stepped up? All the what ifs. But ultimately, myself and one other guy got back into the water, and over 6 hours, did all the swimming and diving and put into action all the training to mean that we were rescued. Salvaging the EPIRB, the SATFO, and the flares, all the kit that would allow us to be found. But I was operating like a robot. I was putting training into action, and I went into a very, very analytical. I came back and journalists said, "Were you scared of shark attack?" And all these what ifs. And the reason I struggle to sit here and think about it is because you can't relate to the mindset you're in when you're in a very, very high stress situation like that. When things are going horribly wrong, your entire lived experience is to get out of there, the fight or flight, to do something, or when you crash just east of Moscow and the whole race is on the line. If you don't get back on the bike, the whole thing's over. You're not thinking, I'm in a lot of pain, I could just give up. You're not thinking that. Your everything is just about getting back on that bike and then managing the pain. And then as you get through that situation, your focus zooms out a little bit and you start to think about, oh my goodness, I can't believe I managed to get through that moment. Or, because when you're in those moments of absolute crisis, you don't have that sort of big picture omniscience. You're not thinking about, all the consequences and all the futures and all the pasts. You're just in that moment. And thankfully, through learned experience, for me, it's on me. I will never assume that anyone else is going to get me out of difficulty. So I've seen people paying the ultimate price. When people are sadly, in the high mountains and dying, or you're in the Atlantic and you think I'm going to die. It brings out a very strange human behavior, and that's not to say that. I say you don't live the emotions at some point in the future, but when you're there, it's just about. It's very much about. It's just very much focusing on what you have to do. It's a topic that I've tried to make sense of a lot, because this is clearly fundamentally important. Maybe not in those extreme situations, but in any organisation, just real accountability. Are you going to do what you said you're going to do? Do you have that sort of personal steel to really make the difficult decisions, do what's necessary? It's at the heart of trust. It's at the heart of integrity. I'm not saying I always get it right. I've made some massive mistakes in my teams, but I'll never. I don't think anyone would ever say I've put my head in the sand or delegated responsibilities. I've always known that I need to be counted. I need to be relevant. I need to do what's necessary. And I find it interesting in business these days because it can be pretty scary. It can be there can be huge consequences for mistakes, but it's rarely life and death. The decisions I make are very consequential for people's livelihoods, but it's not like capsizing in the Atlantic, where if you mess up, somebody dies or you die.
Wow, it's really interesting. It makes me think about kind of whether in your training or in kind of other people's training, is that a part of it that someone kind of coaches you through to be not only let's physically work on your body today, but let's emotionally or psychologically work on these things that may show up when you're in that pressure?
I think it's very, very hard to learn in a classroom or even like peer group learning that that mental toolkit bit. The only way to feel responsibility is to have responsibility. And I find it really interesting because I'm not an adrenaline junkie. Like, I don't go looking to be scared. I don't like being out of control. I'm the opposite. Like, so I'm not going to jump out a plane. I'm not going to, free solo. I'm not going to do anything which, for me, it's the opposite, actually. It's about control. So even though I've done a whole number of things that have put me in harm's way, I don't go looking for the danger element. I think I go looking for... I love the idea of doing stuff that people haven't been done before. And necessarily by having that pioneering spirit, you find yourself in difficult places. You figure out where the edge is. But that doesn't mean that you're looking for trouble. And I think that's an interesting concept, because people always say to me, you must either thrive in that environment, you must go looking for it, or that you're sort of motivated by the suffering. I think that would be a very weird thing to be motivated by. Clearly, to be good at ultra endurance and major expeditions, you have to be quite comfortable in your own head, and you have to have to have the mental toolkit to be able to operate. Do you know what? It's interesting, because talking about crisis situations, I think it's almost blindingly obvious that you either cope or you don't cope. It's quite binary. But I think what's often harder and more close to most people's lived experience is the opposite to crisis. It's the vast periods of time when nobody's watching, where you've got to work hard, but there's nothing really to fight against. And you've just got to turn up and be relevant. So, I can think about cycling around the world and, the times I crashed, and I can talk, in a way that sounds quite heroic about getting back on the bike. But it's very hard to talk about the thousands and thousands and thousands of miles where nothing happened. And I had to get on the bike at 4:00 and I rode. And the days that will never be spoken about, and the shifts that, just were absolutely just part of the process, unseen. And I think that's a far better conversation around performance, because the heroics of, I've got something to fight against and I fought is just human nature. But I think real life is the battle of attrition, which is, who do you want to be? What are the big projects? How do you turn up? How do you be? And actually what people struggle with is life is just the scale of the task. It might be bringing up your kids. It might be starting a business. It might be working for a big corporate. But it's the weeks, months, years, decades that define who you are as a person. And most of that is unseen. It's not amazing anecdotes in the pub with your friends. It's just process. It's diary planning. It's quite boring, but it's life, and it's wonderful. And I think that's the bit that no management consultant speaks about. It always gets talked about as sort of knock it out the park performance, be brilliant, be better, tomorrow has to be better than today, growth mindset, all this nonsense. It's not, you've got to keep kindness at the heart of, the human condition. And you've got to be able to say to people, I'm intrinsically motivated because it matters to me, it matters to my family, it matters to my peers, whoever I'm working with. And the sum of your existence is the time you spend on things. And there's not normally a wonderful anecdote or a crisis to be seen. It's just turning up. And I think it's very hard to answer that question, because the conversation naturally gravitates to the exciting bits that make the news.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that sounds amazing. I love that, actually. You're right, very interesting to kind of see an organisation that operates in that way, or be part of a community where they function on that, like you say, that accountability. I'll do what I say I'm going to do when I do it.
Yeah, I on all the organisations that I work, we don't have any KPIs around sort of knocking it out the park. There's no growth mindset around you have to be constantly better. It's just what you say, what you do matters. Turn up, be consistent. Everyone knows what good looks like. Just think of others. Keep kindness at the heart of organisations. It's meant to be difficult. It matters. You're valued. These are the things that really matter within teams. I think it's very hard, especially as you get into bigger organisations, because people start to feel like life is just some endless quest to improve. If I was to take my 40 people that worked for me on the round the world cycle, and I said to them, does everyone understand how we're going to get around the world in 80 days? They'd go, yes, Mark. Because that's what you say in a team. But they don't. Because if you're my chef, if you're my cameraman, if you're my, finance director, you don't understand how you're going to get around the world in 80 days. Do you understand your job? Yes. Do you understand why it matters? Yes. Okay. So you're a really, really important part in the chain. If everyone does their job properly, we'll get around the world in 80 days. But that's an output that you can't affect. And that's not how teams are normally defined. Normally businesses say, right, we're going to make this turnover this year. And everyone goes, yes, okay. Well, if there's no direct line between your behavior and that output, it's more of a demotivation than a motivation. It's so abstract. So the only way you can really define anything in life, whether it's with your own kids or whatever, is like, why would you matter? Why would you care? What motivates you? Like, how do you build that sort of intrinsic motivation around your behaviours?
Wow. And keen to hear a wee bit more about, I guess, that is your kind of approach to leadership. It sounds very kind of intimate, one-on-one, kind of allowing people to understand the space that they feel and the parameters that they work in. Is that a correct assumption? That's how you lead, and that sounds also very quite tiring. How do you, talk to me more about your kind of leadership?
I guess I'm known for, setting the big goals. This is what I think is possible. I'm rarely the technical expert. I very much rely on people who can back up the ambition, and so I don't micromanage in my teams. I don't pretend that I'm the expert at everything. I try and hire people who are genuinely better at me at most aspects. But it goes back to that idea of being the architect. I think my role is to figure out what other skill sets does it take to be able to do this, and then create the environment for everyone to feel motivated and meaningful in those situations. I don't think it is massively tiring for me, because it would be massively tiring if I was micromanaging people. I'm rarely giving people to-do lists. You're creating the agenda, you're creating clear expectations, and then the accountability sits with everyone in my team to drive the outcomes. It's not really a top-down leadership style that I use. It's I don't know. I've never really tried to describe it before. Do I lead from the back? I don't know what I do. I mean, clearly I'm known for setting pretty big goals. Let's do something that's not been done before. But I think I've got quite a hands-off approach when it comes to the actual day-to-day bit. I have something called pause points with my team, where I clearly check in to make sure that what I'm saying has been understood and whether people are being heard. Pause points also allow for that genuine feedback loop. Does everyone understand what we're doing? Does anyone want to feed into the process? Does anyone have any counter views to what we're trying to do? So I'm very, very clear that you need to have pause points in everyone's sort of schedule and team to make sure that everyone's got a voice. But then between those pause points, there's no room at all for any dissent or other opinion, because once you've had those pause points where everyone can input and there's complete openness and parity, when you then get back to the day job, there's absolute clarity. Everyone's focused on the direction that you've chosen to go on, because you cannot have a constant process of challenge, of checks and balances. So you've got to have very clear delineation between, inputs, opposition, ideas, brainstorm, all that good stuff, which is fundamentally important in an open leadership structure. And then, okay, the decision's made, and whether it's the one you agree with or not, this is what we're doing. And if there continues to be, opposition to that or, friction, then you change the team. And I think I'm quite strong on that. So I'm in one sense very, very open and collaborative, but then I've also got absolute sort of blinkers and laser focus in once you've made those decisions, and then you open it back up, next pause point, is everything going well? Check, 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 everyone happy, great, next go. And I think by having that sort of the extremes of openness, sort of complete flat leadership structure, and then, right, okay, everyone's had their chance now, get on board. It creates real momentum. It creates real sprints, it creates real focus, it creates real clarity, because otherwise you just end up with this really sort of bureaucratic, iterative process around, somebody's going in that direction and other people going in that direction. So my job is just to be the architect for all of those things, as opposed to, some top-down leadership style where you're sort of trying to tell people what to do all the time.
No, that makes sense. That's really...
I think if I'd done more in sort of leadership styles, I would know what that was. But that's sort of I've figured that out over the last 25 years. It works quite well.
Wow. No, obviously, yeah, very good. Do you enjoy kind of setting the vision and bringing people together and kind of going for it and reaching it?
Do I enjoy setting the vision? I mean, the answer is yes. The reason I struggle to answer the question is because I've never really thought about it. I like, it's not like I've sat around and gone, my life has just been have ideas, do it. Have ideas, do it. Create the team, build the finance, do the deals. I've never really stopped and thought, am I doing this because I enjoy doing it? I mean, yes. I mean, the answer is yes. But you've got to be quite comfortable with the unknown. There's always a lot of stuff to be figured out. So if the sum total of your ambition is to, pay the mortgage and have a pension pot, you're not going to do what I've done. There's easier ways to make your money. I absolutely loved what I did, as a career in my 20s and 30s, but every year with my amazing teams, I had to create it. It was a growth business. We did well. It's given me opportunities to do different things in my 40s and into my second chapter of my career. But yeah, I mean, it's very entrepreneurial. There's no roadmap. So I think the reason I'm sort of grappling with the question is I set out on this path relatively early. I thought when I graduated with economics and politics that I could get my CA and, go into finance that way. I've ended up running an investment firm in my 40s, but it's an unusual path to running an impact VC, isn't it? I was a professional athlete and broadcaster, and then I brought my own investments into this and spotted an opportunity and have helped grow a syndicate into a venture capital firm. That's great, but I had to, work on that business for, over 2 years before I took anything out of it. So, and I think back to my early career in my early 20s, and again there was a big period of investment before there was anything back from it in terms of financial security. So enjoyment doesn't always mean this is a barrel of laughs, like this is great fun, but enjoyment in terms of, this is hugely fulfilling, slightly scary, there's a massive roller coaster, but amazing sort of shared responsibility when you pull these things off. And I say we in terms of my family. I say we in terms of my friends, my colleagues, the people I've worked with over the years. I think the thing I'm most proud of, if I look back over the last 20 years, is I can point at a whole series of business ventures and career projects and educational things, and I go, well, that's what I did. Not just I was there, but that's what we did. And that's something I'm very proud of, because being able to point at stuff and say that's what I did is having the ability to have the ideas, back your ideas, create the environment for those successes. And then what's, I guess, slightly unkind with life is you never really have time to reflect on that. I mean, that's why I find conversations like this interesting but challenging, because that's not how you live your life. I don't look back and go, oh my goodness, weren't the last 20 years wonderful? I mean, they were great fun, but bloody hell, they were hard. And would I have it any other way? No. But life is full of binary choices. Do I do this? Do I do that? And you live by those choices, and it takes you in many, many different directions. But there's 10,000 other combinations over the last 20 years that would have taken my career in very different ways. It's been fun. It's not always been easy, but it's been hugely fulfilling. And I think, I think about my girls, if I was to pass one thing on to them, it's to have that sense of, this is worth it. This is worth it. What I'm doing means something, and not just means something to you, because when you're an athlete, you're allowed to be selfish, but what you're doing has got some wider purpose to it. Because if you don't have purpose in your work, I think as a the human condition, you end up fundamentally quite unhappy. You can be wealthy, you can have public profile, but happiness doesn't come from either of those things. Happiness comes from a sense of, you've actually, the pillars of your life, the pillars of your identity, your family, your work, your community, you're relevant to those things in a way that matters.
That's amazing, Mark. Your kind of insight and learning is just a real privilege to listen to. Thank you. I was curious about kind of, obviously the first kind of series of adventures you've done were primarily on the bike, and then kind of you moved away from that. You've done climbing, you've done rowing, swimming, running, and then more on the bike. Did you kind of miss the bike at all when it wasn't there, or was it nice to kind of try and push your body in a different way?
I mean, cycling is very much where I started, and kind of where I finished my professional career in sport. The thing is about, even though I had quite big teams with me at times, the cycling was on me. If I failed, everyone failed. Ultimately I'm on the bike. So, whereas when I was doing the other things like ocean rowing or mountaineering or Arctic, I was part of a team. You learn a huge amount from expeditions and projects where you're not the team lead, because if you're the team lead, it's your decision, and you can't fall out with yourself too badly for too long. Whereas when the decisions are made by other people, because you simply couldn't, you don't have the experience in that environment or that sport or whatever it is, when you don't have the experience to make that leadership decision, clearly it puts you in a totally different mindset. You have to trust. You have to trust the decisions that other people would make. And I hope that it gives me more empathy when I'm in a situation where I'm perfectly comfortable, but others aren't. So I'm making decisions and I'm sort of thinking, well, why are they acting that way? Why are they speaking that way? Why are they not doing what they said they were going to do? Well, often because, whether it's the right decision or the wrong decision, it's that behavioural change under pressure. So I'm acutely aware of, having been in these sort of situations miles out of my comfort zone, how my behaviour and my actions changed. And I think there was something really positive about that. If I'd spent my life just in my lane, doing what I did, riding my bike and just doing one thing, and I think it's quite natural as you sort of take on different projects in life to have that imposter syndrome. Everyone does it. How you see yourself versus how other people see you is always going to be different. I still see myself as that little homeschooled boy, who grew up and took on big adventures. Whereas other people, especially if they just meet me when I've just come off stage, they meet me as like some, author and broadcaster and sort of established. And I'm like, well, that's not how you see yourself. So that question around doing completely different things, which are not necessarily your core skill set, I think is quite helpful, because I think it helps as you move your own career on and do different things to not be too stuck in your lane. And I think it allows you to empathize more with other people and their sort of reactions to high pressure situations.
Very cool. You mentioned about the kind of broadcasting element. As kind of a high performance athlete doing these epic adventures, did you ever feel that kind of sharing it and bringing everyone along with the story, although that was, I mean, amazing kind of for people who don't get to see these things, as amazing as that was that ever a kind of hindrance to be like, oh, now I need to do this part, but actually I want to be doing this?
Yeah, it's a good question. For me, the broadcast element was always part and parcel. That was the job. I feel lucky that my career started really at the start of the sort of the properly digital era. So my first BBC documentary was filmed onto mini DV, so reel-to-reel cassette. That wasn't that long ago, but technology has moved on a lot. So the first time I cycled around the world when I was in my early 20s, I was very much living it for myself and sharing it with a camera. And then it was all told afterwards. It was a BBC One documentary series, and I got to write a book. And so I lived the journey, captured the journey, and then shared the journey. Whereas then from my second expedition onwards, which was the Americas, 13,000 miles down from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, it was a real-time storytelling. At that point, Twitter had just been invented, and social media was a new thing. So I know we're only just talking about sort of 15, 16 years ago now, but a lot has changed in that time. So the mindset change, going from capturing something and being immersed in the storytelling, and that obligation to real-time storytell has completely changed broadcast. Of course it has, but it also, as an athlete, completely changes your mindset on the road. That need to immediately broadcast what you're doing, as opposed to having time and space to live it and then share it afterwards. So yeah, I always encourage athletes who are getting into this space to go on a journey for themselves. Don't to build a brand straight away, to actually sort of build their core skill sets, to do what they do, capture it themselves, rather than, be an influencer from day one, be more about the story than about the journey. You've got to be able to do both, but understanding your own why and being comfortable in that space without the constant noise of content creation and social media is quite important to layer up in that way. Because I know lots of people these days that almost try and start with the brand and the storytelling and then come back to the credibility to actually do the thing to begin with. And for me, it's all about credibility. Do you have the credibility to actually live the journey, be the narrator for that, and then learn the skill set to share it? And as I say, that word credibility is fundamentally important. You've got to have done it. You've got to have that lived experience before you can then become, a spokesperson for it. And I always think when I'm out on these journeys, I do have that rare privilege to take people on adventures. It's the sheer wanderlust of it. I'm showcasing 130 countries and counting, and places that people are rarely going to get to see themselves. And those human interactions that happen once that you then get to share with, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, that's a rare privilege. I wish when I got into documentary making in my early 20s, for me initially it was quite a utilitarian sum. It was like, I need to give return on investment to my sponsors. And it was working with the great late David Peat, who was an amazing filmmaker and documentary maker. He started his career in the 60s doing street photography in Glasgow and, filming with Billy Connolly and, Big Banana Feet and all the stuff. So he'd gone from that, and then towards the end of his career worked with me. And he shared that great passion for storytelling, for like the human interaction, observational documentaries, just that fly on the wall, which I became absolutely the heart of my career. Less so now. I don't get as much time or opportunity to. But for me, when I was at school, I loved art. And then I sort of ended up doing more academic things. I studied economics and politics. But actually becoming a filmmaker in my 20s and 30s kind of felt full circle back to my passion as a kid as an artist, because it was about that creative process, which I ended up absolutely loving.
Wow, that's brilliant. What was it like kind of realising that maybe there needed to be a change and it was time to transition to something new, chapter 2 as you kind of referenced it? What was that transition like, and those kind of movements in I guess, like, psychologically, I'm changing now from this to this?
I think one of the hardest things with changing your career is your own sense of identity, how you see yourself, how you interact with the world. So, people will always know me as an around the world cyclist, and there's worse things to be known for. But I've when that's no longer what you do, I think you've got to reframe your own credibility, your own purpose. There's a real risk when you've been an athlete in your 20s and 30s to then just live off the coattails of what you did. So there was plenty of opportunities. I could have spent, the rest of my career coaching or, doing keynote speeches and conferences. But I like doing stuff. I like building projects. And I want the next 20 years to be as hard as the last 20 years, but different. So actually the idea of just doing a pale version of what I once did bears little motivation. So even though it's hard to change, it's hard to have a second chapter, I think it's fundamentally important to recognise that. When you've had a public profile and success with your career, the temptation is to live in the box that you created for yourself. It's so easy just to go, the thing that you strove for and built, you then become a prisoner of. You've sort of created that momentum, you've created that profile, and then you're no longer in charge of it. You sort of get pushed around by other people's expectations, and life is no longer of your making. So for me, the career change was a very conscious one. It was like, wow, it would be relatively straightforward to keep riding my bike, going on adventures and making films. And I'll always ride my bike and have fun with a camera, but it doesn't need to be my job anymore. So evolving into what I do now, which is running a venture capital firm focused on impact. So healthcare, environment, sustainability. I'm very excited about science and technology that is trying to address the big issues of the day. So it could be better early stage cancer diagnostics. It could be taking microbead plastics out of the oceans. It could be, stem cell technology and industrial biotechnology. It could be, more sustainable agri-tech, all sorts of things they're not, B2C brands. It's not, creating a new mug or a new gin or something like that. This is knowledge intensive science and technology, which is, for me, looking at the world and the sustainability issues that we've got, whether it's on the human side or on the planet side. I'd like to, in my own way, be relevant to that. Now, I don't have a silver bullet. I'm not a scientist. But how can I be relevant to, the world that we live? Well, Scotland has amazing academic research. It's got amazing universities. It's got amazing generation of IP and ideas. The opportunity is to do a better job of that tech transfer and taking what is happening in a small country like Scotland and scaling these into much bigger commercial markets. Because none of these ideas are Scottish. They are, global issues, global opportunities. And I've spent my life traveling globally. I've got a global network. I've got a global mindset. And it's my job to build that global blueprint around how we take the very best ideas and, how do I be the boots on the ground but scale them? So I could invest personally, as I did in my 30s. And then I spotted the opportunity with an amazing team to do that more systematically. And, we're now backing half a dozen companies a year. And, my way of thinking about it is, imagine over the next 10 years, we could find, understand and scale 60 companies, all improving quality of life and sustainability on the planet. They won't all go gangbusters, but it's our job to put a spotlight on them and give them the opportunity to flourish. That would be time well spent. And what's my job in that? Well, again, is to be the architect. I need to bring in people who have a technical competence, transactional, scientific, which is far beyond what mine is. But my job has always been to be a connector and to spot opportunities and to be a catalyst for that potential. And, I think realizing that there's only one part that you can play in that big puzzle, but ultimately you're a lot more effective if you can do it with that real intensity. I did it as an athlete and a broadcaster, and I'm now doing it as an impact investor. And there's such amazing opportunity. Honestly, what's on our doorstep here in Scotland is incredible. And for every time the pessimist says to me, oh, we could be better at this, I just see the flip side of that, which is opportunity. And the opportunity to do it better. And I think of the 20 years that I was a professional athlete and we took the round the world record from 276 days down to 78 days. Well, nobody 20 years ago imagined that you could go around the world 200 days quicker than we did back then. It took hard work, it took vision, it took incredible collaboration to do that. So imagine what we could do in terms of scaling innovation in the next 20 years. And I'm surrounded by people, politicians and business people who talk about the challenges and the issues. And that's great. You talk about those all day long. But the flip side of those exact issues is potential, and the potential to do things better and differently. And actually it's helpful if you spent your life doing firsts and fastest, people are saying it's impossible, it's difficult to do. That's great. I mean, by definition, that is the skill set. Without being crazy, spotting the opportunity, building the teams, and being a catalyst for that change. That's it in a nutshell. And it kind of brings us back to the start of the conversation. It's the same thing. It's a totally different application, but it's the same thing. It's how do you get people to work with intensity and speed on projects where you're fundamentally shifting the dial. And I love it. It does feel different than when I was an athlete. When I was an athlete, there was the personal application. I would be out there and I was very much accountable for driving that. Now, when you're an investor, you're about creating the right environment for the teams, the right incentives, but you feel more like a puppeteer. You feel sort of one step removed because you're not actually driving the business yourself. You're no longer on the bike. But we can sit there at this point in time and say, well, but then we've got 20 exciting companies all trying to build that same culture, that same intensity, and that same positive impact in the world.
Amazing. Wow. That's so, I really love how it's like that transferred skills, just I'll do the same thing, just a different kind of application. Amazing. What, you've given us absolutely masses of incredible advice and learns. If there was just like one golden nugget, what would you love to kind of pass on to the next generation of entrepreneurs?
I feel that entrepreneurship is far too often about individual pursuit and far too often about starting something for yourself. For me, entrepreneurship is more of an attitude around being pioneering. So you can be very entrepreneurial within an organization, you can be entrepreneurial within your own family. So for me, this idea of having quiet confidence to back your own ideas, it can often get taught out of young people. And I guess I'll return to the thought that if my daughters are book smart, great, that will certainly help. But being book smart will not create the leaps in performance, the sorts of projects that I've been sort of motivated by throughout my career. The skill set, the mindset that I would like to sort of share with my own kids and certainly with the founders that I work with is back yourself. Have that belief. Have clarity. Learn from others. Be a student of history, but for goodness sake, don't base your targets on what other people have done. Have that context to the world you operate in. So people often go, well, I want to climb Everest or cycle around the world. And I'm going, great. Have you ever climbed a Munro before? Have you cycled across Scotland? So learn your trade. And I think that gap between the dream, like what do you want to do, and actually the process, what's the life you're actually going to lead, is kind of the most important bit. And at the heart of all of this conversation is really about how do you want to spend your life? Like, what do you actually want to do? And I think there's a big void between how people see me when they see the results and what I actually do from when the alarm goes off in the morning and I put my head back on the pillow. I love what I do. I genuinely love what I do. But I'm not sure that many other people would enjoy what I do, and nor should they, because it's not their life. So I think that personal choice, that quiet confidence, I think for the next generation, that's it in a nutshell, isn't it? Because it's not ego, it's not arrogance. It's more just having the clarity to follow your ideas and build partnerships to make them happen.
Yeah, definitely. That's incredible. And finally, Mark, what legacy would you like to leave?
The best feedback I ever get is when people say to me, I read your book. It's normally the books rather than the films, because there's something about the engagement to read somebody else's book. I read your story, I followed your journey, and it gave me the... And when somebody takes the time to tell me that something that they've done is because of something I've done. I've not told them what to do, I'm not a coach, but if I've in some way unlocked their quiet confidence to do what they wanted to do anyway, but for whatever reason in life, they hadn't prioritized it, they hadn't got on with it, that's the best thing for me. I absolutely love it when people go, I did this because, you somehow, helped me prioritize that or get on with it. And there's some pretty cool stuff. Somebody emailed me today who wanted to cycle around the world. Their parents didn't want them to cycle around the world. They put out they put out something on a notice board, Facebook, I think, to say that they were going to cycle around the world. Somebody else got in touch, said, I want to do that too. So they ended up buddying up. And they cycled around the world together, having not known each other. And now they've got married, and she's just published a book. And, I've never met them. But, it's amazing to think that, in a sort of butterfly effect way, by sharing my story over the last 25 years, that gave her the quiet confidence to put the idea out there. She then met somebody, she did it, and that's changed her life forever. That's amazing. I've never met the lady. But those things happen more often than you might think.
Wow, that must be a real honour and privilege for you to kind of hear that.
Yeah, it's fun.
Very cool.
But you never know, and you don't do things because of that reason, but it's fun when you hear.
Yeah. Well, Mark, thank you so much for your time today and sharing. There's just so much in that. What a wealth of a journey that you've had, so many experiences, and
good fun.
Excited to see what's next for you, so thank you.
Cheers, good fun, thanks.
Thank you for joining us on Legacy Conversations. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it beneficial. I'm looking forward to the next one.